The battlefield on Armageddon was a site of chaos and destruction. The once proud and industrial world now lay in ruins, its spires and factories reduced to smoldering heaps of twisted metal. The sky was painted in shades of red and black, thick clouds of smoke swirling above the remnants of a city that had once thrived under the Imperium's rule. In the midst of the carnage, a figure stood, unwavering, his heavy coat billowing in the wind. Commissar Yarrick, the legendary hero of the Imperium, was a symbol of unyielding defiance against the forces of chaos. His mechanical bionic arm, a testament to his survival through countless battles, clenched tightly around the hilt of his power sword. His black trench coat was tattered, but his face scarred, weathered, and grim was resolute. Beside him, the soldiers of the Armageddon Steel Legion stood firm, their faces set in grim determination. These men, trained to fight in the most brutal of conditions, had already witnessed the death of thousands of their comrades, but they remained unwavering in their loyalty to the Imperium. Their courage was rooted in the leadership of one man, Commissar Yarrick, who had been a symbol of hope and defiance for them. But today, that symbol was faltering. The Orcs, led by the monstrous Ghazghkull Thraka, had breached the last line of defense. The Orcs were everywhere, screaming their battle cries as they charged the Imperial lines with relentless force. Yarrick's voice boomed through his voxcaster as he issued commands to his men, rallying them for one last stand. But even his powerful presence couldn't mask the weight of what was coming. The Orcs were too many, and their brutality too overwhelming. "Hold the line," Yarrick shouted, his voice full of fury. "For the Emperor, for Armageddon." But the line was breaking. Yarrick fought with the ferocity of a man possessed. His power sword cleaved through orc after orc, the energy blade cutting through their massive bodies with ease. Yet, for every orc he cut down, 2 more took its place. His soldiers fought valiantly beside him, but the tide of battle was not in their favor. The orcs, with their crude but effective war machines, were winning. As the battle raged on, Yarrick found himself face to face with Ghazghkull. The Orc warlord towered over the Commissar, his grotesque form armored in the heaviest of plates, his eyes burning with the savage joy of impending victory. "You're too late, human," Ghazghkull bellowed, his voice like thunder. "The war is unstoppable. You cannot defeat me, and you cannot stop the destruction of your world." Yarrick's eyes burned with the fire of defiance. "As long as I breathe, Orc, you will never have Armageddon." With a roar, Yarrick lunged at Ghazghkull, his power sword raised high. The 2 warriors clashed in a flurry of steel and fury. Yarrick's bionic arm and sword struck with precision, but Ghazghkull's brute strength and massive warhammer made him a formidable foe. The 2 fought relentlessly, each blow echoing across the battlefield, but it was clear that the Orc was stronger. With a deafening crash, Ghazghkull brought his warhammer down on Yarrick's chest, sending him sprawling to the ground. The force of the blow shattered Yarrick's bionic arm and sent a shockwave of pain through his body. Yarrick struggled to rise, blood pouring from his wounds, but Ghazghkull was relentless. The Orc warlord raised his hammer once more, preparing to deliver the killing blow. "This is the end, human." Ghazghkull sneered, but just as Ghazghkull swung down, Yarrick, through sheer willpower, managed to raise his power sword in a desperate attempt to block. The blade collided with Ghazghkull's hammer with an explosive crash, sending a shower of sparks flying into the air. Yarrick's vision blurred, and his strength was failing him. His soldiers could only watch in horror as their leader, their symbol of hope, was pushed to his limits. The sound of a sudden explosion rang out behind them. A massive Orc war machine, an Imperial knight that had been corrupted by the Orcs, tore through the Imperial lines, crashing into the ground with a tremendous quake. The impact sent debris flying, and for a brief moment, Yarrick and Ghazghkull were thrown apart. Yarrick staggered to his feet, his breath ragged and his body broken. The battlefield had become a nightmare of crumbling buildings, billowing smoke, and the dying cries of soldiers. But even as his strength began to fail him, the Commissar's spirit remained unbroken. "We must hold on," Yarrick shouted to his men, his voice filled with raw determination. But as he looked around, he saw that the line was collapsing. His soldiers were being overrun, and the orcs were advancing faster than ever. Ghazghkull, uninjured and full of bloodlust, loomed above him once again, his hammer raised high. It was at that moment that Yarrick realized the truth. The Imperium, for all its might, could not win this battle. Armageddon was lost. The Emperor's will had failed in the face of such overwhelming chaos. With one final breath, Yarrick closed his eyes and prepared to meet his fate. He had given everything for his world, for the Imperium, and for the soldiers who had fought beside him. But his time had come. In the end, Commissar Yarrick fell, not with a cry of despair, but with a quiet, defiant whisper. For the Emperor. The death of Commissar Yarrick reverberated across the battlefield like a thunderclap, a terrible silence following the final clash between him and Ghazghkull. His body lay amidst the wreckage of the battlefield, a symbol of defiance crushed beneath the relentless force of the Orc warlord. The soldiers of the Armageddon Steel Legion stood frozen, their hearts heavy with the realization that their leader, their guiding light, was gone. The Orcs, sensing the shift in momentum, roared in victory, pushing their assault forward with renewed vigor. The Imperium was reeling. Yarrick's death shattered the morale of the Imperial forces, and with no one to rally behind, they faltered. The battle lines, once a well-coordinated wall of defense, began to crumble as chaos spread like wildfire. The once proud defenses of Armageddon fortifications, tanks and artillery were no match for the onslaught of the Orcs. General Gabriel Zane, a senior officer in the Armageddon Steel Legion, stood amidst the chaos, his eyes locked on the fallen Commissar. His face was grim, his mind racing. He was no stranger to war, but the loss of Yarrick was a blow to the very soul of the Imperium. The Commissar had been more than just a military leader. He had been a symbol of the Emperor's strength and resolve. Without him, what hope did they have? General Zane, a voice barked from behind him. Zane turned to see Colonel Schaefer, another officer of the Steel Legion, approaching at a rapid pace. His uniform was torn, and blood stained his face, but there was a fire in his eyes that mirrored Zane's own. "We've lost the line, sir. The Orcs are pushing through the south sector. Our forces are retreating." Zane gritted his teeth. "Damn it. We need to regroup. We can't let them overrun the entire city. The men are shattered, sir. They're losing their will to fight." Yarrick, he was their strength. Schaefer's voice wavered, betraying the toll the battle had taken on him. "We need to pull back." Zane shook his head, his expression hardening. "No, we can't retreat. Not yet. We're not finished until we've drawn the Orcs into a killing zone." As he spoke, a distant rumble shook the ground beneath them. The sky was dark with the smoke of war, but through the haze, the unmistakable shapes of Orc war machines could be seen advancing across the field, their massive wheels grinding over the broken terrain. The Orcs were coming, and there was no stopping them. "We need reinforcements." Zane turned to Schaefer, his voice tinged with desperation. "Contact the rest of the Imperial Guard. We'll fight them back, or we'll die trying." End of Kane now. The two officers exchanged a brief, grim look before Schaefer turned to execute the order. Zane stood alone for a moment, gazing out at the battle around him. His soldiers were brave, but their resolve was weakening without Yarrick to lead them. He could see it in their eyes, the fear, the doubt, but he couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. In the distant trenches, Captain Alrahem, commander of the Armageddon Steel Legion's 101st Regiment, gathered his remaining troops. His face was covered in dirt and blood, but his eyes burned with determination. The young captain had fought in countless battles, but none had tested his mettle like this one. Yarrick had been his inspiration, the reason he had joined the Imperial Guard in the first place. Now, with the loss of his leader, the weight of command pressed heavily upon him. "Listen up, men," Alrahem shouted, his voice echoing through the trenches. "Yarrick's gone, but that doesn't mean we give up. The Emperor's will still burns in us. We'll stand our ground, and we'll drive these green-skinned bastards off our world." The men responded with a cheer, but it was weak. They had lost their guiding light, their hero. Now, they had to fight for themselves, and the fear of failure gnawed at them. "Get the wounded to the rear," Alrahem barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. We'll hold them here, for Yarrick, for Armageddon." As his men began to dig in, preparing for the final defense, Alrahem's thoughts turned to the coming battle. The orcs were relentless, and without Yarrick's presence to inspire them, the Steel Legion was on the verge of collapse. They needed a miracle. Meanwhile, in the heart of the orc offensive, Ghazghkull Thraka surveyed the battlefield from his massive warbike. The death of Yarrick had been the signal for him to push forward with his War. The Imperium had lost its strongest leader, and now was the time to strike. "Ghazghkull's the greatest," he bellowed to his orc lieutenants, laughing as his voice echoed across the battlefield. "Now we smash 'em, we take Armageddon, for Dawar." End of. His orcs roared in agreement, their eyes glowing with the thrill of battle. The defeat of Yarrick had been their victory, and now they would crush the remaining human resistance beneath their boots. The orc war machines charged forward, their guns roaring as they tore through the remnants of the Imperial defenses. Back at the Imperial Command Center, General Zane's mind raced as he tried to formulate a strategy to stem the tide of the orc invasion. He had sent out calls for reinforcements, but the sheer magnitude of the orc offensive left him with little hope. The Emperor's light seemed to be dimming over Armageddon, and with Yarrick's death, it felt like the soul of the world had been lost. The general turned to face the holographic map of the battlefield. The orcs were pushing through every sector. His fingers trembled as he zoomed in on the map, trying to find a point where they could stand their ground. "Damn it, Yarrick," Zane muttered, staring at the map. Without the Commissar, they were struggling to hold the line. The Emperor's will still burned within him, but it felt weaker than ever. He had to hold on. Armageddon had to survive. "We'll fight them to the last man." He clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. For Yarrick, for Armageddon. The sky above Armageddon had turned from a deep crimson to a sickly yellow, a color born of the ever-present smoke and the flickering light of burning cities. The world was dying, but the Imperium soldiers still fought with every ounce of strength they had. The loss of Commissar Yarrick had left a gaping wound in the heart of the Imperial forces, but there was no time to mourn. The orcs were coming in waves, their war machines rumbling forward, crushing everything in their path. In the makeshift command center that had replaced the once great fortress of Hive Hellion, General Gabriel Zane paced back and forth, his mind working feverishly to formulate a new plan. The holographic map in front of him displayed the full extent of the orc advance, one that had already consumed the southern reaches of Armageddon and was quickly moving toward the industrial heart of the world. His hands clenched into fists as he watched the progress of the orc forces. "We're being overrun, sir." The voice of Colonel Schaefer cut through the tension. The colonel had been a veteran of countless campaigns, but even he was beginning to show signs of stress. The pressure was mounting on all sides. "I see that, Schaefer." Zane's voice was low, barely a whisper, but the weight of command in it was undeniable. "We cannot give in. Armageddon will not fall, not like this." Schaefer didn't reply. He simply nodded and turned to relay the orders to the staff officers gathered nearby. Zane's eyes fell to the map again, his mind racing. He had no illusions about the strength of the orc forces. Ghazghkull was a warlord unlike any other, and his War was pushing forward with unrelenting speed. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming odds, Zane refused to accept defeat. He turned sharply as the doors to the command center slammed open, and Captain Alrahem walked in, his armor battered, but his expression resolute. "Sir, we've lost the western sector. The 13th and 14th regiments are in full retreat." Zane's jaw tightened. "Damn it! The Steel Legion is holding their positions in the north for now," Alrahem continued, his voice steady despite the desperation in his eyes. "But without reinforcements, they won't last long." "Endo, we don't have the luxury of reinforcements, Captain." Zane's voice was sharp, cutting through the heavy silence that had settled over the room. "We're on our own. We need to regroup, fortify the southern industrial zones, and prepare for a counterattack." "A counterattack?" Schaefer raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "We're already on the defensive, sir. The orcs have us pinned down." "Then we hold them at any cost," Zane barked, his voice filled with raw determination. "We'll give them hell before they take one more inch of this world. We fight, not because we can win, but because we have no other choice." The officers around him nodded, their faces grim but resolute. The command center buzzed with the sound of orders being shouted, soldiers moving to execute their commands. The Imperium's last stand on Armageddon was beginning. Meanwhile, in the shattered ruins of the Hive City, Captain Al-Rahem stood with his back against the wall of a crumbling building, peering through a shattered window at the advancing Orc forces. His eyes were tired, his body aching from hours of relentless combat, but his mind was sharp, focused. Beside him, his regiment's remnants prepared their defenses, setting up barricades and preparing last-ditch gun placements. The Orcs were coming. He could hear their war cries in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. "We've held them off for as long as we could," Al-Rahem muttered to no one in particular, his voice barely above a whisper. "But now we die on our feet, or we don't die at all." A soldier, his face covered in grime and blood, walked up to Al-Rahem. "Sir, we've received orders to fortify the southern lines, the Steel Legion's pushing back, but we're still on our own here." "Damn right we are." Al-Rahem grinned bitterly, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his las pistol. "Get everyone ready. If the Orcs want Armageddon, they'll have to kill every last one of us." The soldier nodded and hurried off, and Al-Rahem turned back to the window, his mind running through the strategic possibilities. His men were exhausted, but they were not broken. They had faced overwhelming odds before, and they would do so again. But without the inspirational leadership of Commissar Yarrick, Al-Rahem knew that the fight would be much harder. The first Orc war machines began to rumble into view. The ground trembled beneath their massive wheels, and the air filled with the sound of Orc engines roaring to life. It was a sight to behold hundreds of Orc battle wagons, looted wagons, and stompers charging across the battlefield, their crude weapons primed for destruction. "Here they come," Al-Rahem said softly. "This is it. Hold the line, men. We fight for the Emperor and for Armageddon." The first volley of Orc fire struck the Imperial positions, and the battle began anew. Back at the Imperial command, General Zane paced relentlessly, his mind spinning with 100 different thoughts. The Orcs were getting closer, their presence overwhelming the southern defenses. He had sent out every possible reinforcement, but it wouldn't be enough. He could only pray that the men of the Steel Legion and the last remnants of the Armageddon Guard could hold out long enough for a counter-offensive. A sudden explosion rocked the building, and the room went dark as the power generators flickered out. The command center was thrown into chaos as officers scrambled to restore order. "Status report," Zane shouted, trying to keep control. A voice shouted back, "Sir, the south sector has collapsed. The Orcs have broken through." Zane's face hardened. "Then we fall back to the fallback position at the Hive's heart. We're not giving up Armageddon without a fight." The war for Armageddon was a brutal and unrelenting struggle, and without Commissar Yarrick's leadership, the forces of the Imperium were struggling to stay afloat. The Orc forces, with Ghazghkull leading them, showed no signs of slowing down. Every day, the line between victory and defeat grew thinner, and the world of Armageddon was slowly slipping into the hands of chaos. As the days passed, Zane and Al-Rahem continued their efforts to hold the Imperium's remaining forces together. The odds were long, but they were determined. As long as they had breath in their lungs, they would fight. The air over Armageddon was thick with the acrid smoke of battle. The once proud industrial world, a beacon of imperial might, now lay in tatters, its once gleaming spires reduced to rubble. The Orc War had turned the planet into a hellscape, and the Imperium's forces were barely holding on. General Gabriel Zane stood in the middle of the command center, his hands clenched into fists. His face was haggard, his eyes sunken from days without sleep. The holographic map in front of him flickered, showing the spread of the Orc forces as they continued to advance across Armageddon. "We are losing this world," Zane muttered, his voice barely audible. "There's no way around it." His officers gathered around him, their faces grim. The room was filled with the scent of sweat and burnt machinery. The once organized chaos of the battle had transformed into a desperate struggle for survival. The Orcs had broken through every defensive line, and the southern sector had fallen. The industrial cities were in ruins, and the heart of Armageddon was now within Ghazghkull Thraka's reach. "What's the status on reinforcements?" Zane asked, though he knew the answer. "There are none, sir," a voice replied from behind him. It was Colonel Schaefer, his uniform tattered, his expression filled with exhaustion. "The Orcs have already overwhelmed the southern and western lines. The reinforcements we called for weeks ago have either been destroyed or are stuck in transit. There's nothing left to stop them." Zane's fist slammed down onto the map table with a thud. The sheer weight of the situation pressed on him. His forces were fractured, their morale shattered, and without Yarrick, their inspiration was gone. He had led them through countless battles, and now, in the face of overwhelming odds, Zane was beginning to wonder if the fight was even worth it. "We're not giving up yet," Zane finally said, his voice a bit firmer. "The Steel Legion's holding the northern lines for now. We have to focus on that. We need to fortify what's left of the hive." "Sir," Schaefer interjected, "we can't keep pushing forward like this. The Orcs will breach the northern lines next, and if they do, we'll be cut off from the rest of the planet." Zane turned to look at Schaefer, his eyes narrowing. "Then we make our last stand in the heart of the hive. We will hold that ground, no matter the cost. The Emperor did not abandon us in our darkest hour, and we will not abandon him now." The officers fell silent. It was a plan born out of desperation, but it was all they had left. On the front lines, Captain Alrahem was already making preparations for the final defense of the Northern Hive, the last bastion of Imperial strength on Armageddon. The Steel Legion had been stretched thin, with many of its regiments having already taken heavy casualties. The Orcs had pushed them back, and now only a few hundred men remained to defend the last of the Hive's entrances. "We can't hold this position for long, Captain," one of Al-Rahem's officers said, his voice filled with resignation. "The Orcs are too strong, and our weapons are running low. We've lost too many men already." Al-Rahem nodded grimly. "I know, but we'll hold until the end." He paused, turning to face his men. The soldiers under his command were exhausted, their faces gaunt from days of constant battle. But even now, their resolve was unbroken. The steel of the Steel Legion would not bend. "We fight for Armageddon, we fight for the Emperor, and we fight for every man who died to bring us this far." A chorus of "For the Emperor" rang out across the front, the men rallying behind their captain, their final battle cry echoing through the ruined streets. "Ready the guns," Al-Rahem commanded. "Prepare the barricades. We make our stand here." As the Steel Legion prepared to face the overwhelming Orc hordes, the ground shook beneath their feet. The roar of Orc war machines grew louder, and in the distance, Al-Rahem saw the telltale signs of an incoming Orc assault. The Orc stompers lumbered forward, their massive feet crushing everything in their path. They were followed by a line of battle wagons, their cannons roaring as they fired on the Imperial positions. "Here they come, men! Hold your ground!" Al-Rahem shouted, his voice commanding. The men of the Steel Legion responded with a fierce cheer, their lasguns raised, their hearts filled with resolve. Back at the Imperial command, Zane and his officers were preparing to issue their final orders. The Orcs were drawing closer, and the last pockets of resistance were quickly being overwhelmed. Zane knew that his time was running out. His officers stood around him, awaiting his next command. "We can't win this fight," Zane said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of truth. "But we can make sure that Armageddon's death isn't in vain. We will take down as many of them as we can. We will go down fighting." His officers nodded, their faces filled with grim acceptance. They had lost so much, and now, with the Orcs at their gates, all they had left was their honor. The Emperor had given them the strength to hold fast until the end, and that was what they would do. "Send the order," Zane continued. "Every regiment, every last man, will fight to the bitter end. We are the shield of the Imperium, and we will die as we lived, defying the enemies of mankind." Uniform, the command went out, and the final defense of Armageddon began. As the Steel Legion stood ready, the Orcs were upon them. The ground shook as the Orc war machines advanced, their cannons firing in all directions. The battle wagons blasted apart Imperial defenses, their crude guns sending shockwaves of destruction across the battlefield. The Stompers trampled over anything in their path, their massive feet crushing soldiers beneath them like ants. "For the Emperor!" Al-Rahem roared as he led the charge, his men fighting with all the fury they had left. The last stand of the Steel Legion had begun. Meanwhile, far above Armageddon, the Imperial Navy began their final assault on the planet. The massive ships of the Imperial fleet loomed in the skies, their cannons primed and ready to strike. It was a desperate gambit, a final attempt to break the Orc siege and prevent the total loss of Armageddon. But the Orcs were already too deep in the heart of the planet, and the Imperium's ships had no way of reaching them in time. The light of Armageddon's twin suns barely pierced the thick, choking smoke that covered the battlefield. For days, the world had been racked by the brutality of the Orc War. The once thriving industrial world was now a nightmare of twisted metal and crumbled ruins. The Orcs had taken the southern and western sectors, and now their massive war machines rumbled toward the heart of the hive. General Zane stood at the center of the command room, his face grim as the reports continued to come in. The defenses were faltering, the Orc warbands were everywhere, too many to count. His officers, exhausted and battle-worn, gathered around him, their faces showing the strain of a battle that seemed never-ending. "Report," Zane barked, his voice sharp, yet carrying the weight of the responsibility that was bearing down on him. "Sir, the northern sector has held for now." The voice of Lieutenant Harris echoed across the room. He was a seasoned officer, but even he looked weary. "But we've lost contact with the reserves. The Orcs are closing in from all sides." Zane's hand clenched into a fist. The Orcs were relentless, and even the heroic efforts of the Steel Legion and Armageddon Guard were beginning to wear thin. Without the guidance of Commissar Yarrick, the Imperial forces were finding it harder to hold the line. "We need to fall back to the underground bunkers." Zane's voice was steady, but his mind was racing. The Imperium's forces were not enough to face the sheer scale of the Orc invasion. He turned to Captain Alrahem, who was pacing nearby. Alrahem's face was etched with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with the fire of defiance. "Captain, how many men do we have left?" Zane asked, his voice quieter now. "Not enough, sir," Alrahem replied, his gaze hardening. "The Steel Legion has taken heavy casualties. Only a few hundred remain at full strength. The rest are either dead, wounded, or too demoralized to continue." Zane nodded grimly. He had known the toll would be high, but hearing the confirmation only made the reality sink deeper. Armageddon was lost. "Then we fight in the tunnels," Zane declared, his voice resolute. "We'll make our last stand in the depths. If we cannot stop them on the surface, then we'll fight them beneath the ground, where they cannot bring their war machines to bear." He turned to face the map that dominated the room, his finger tracing the complex network of tunnels that wound beneath the hive. "We'll hold them in the underground chambers. Every man, every last soldier will die for this world. We are the last defense for Armageddon. We will not let the Emperor down." Then the officers gathered around him, their faces hardening with determination. They knew that this would be their final stand. The Orcs would not stop until they had consumed everything on the surface, and if they could not hold the line underground, the fate of the entire planet would be sealed. Meanwhile, in the heart of the hive, Captain Alrahem rallied the remaining forces of the Steel Legion. They had fought valiantly, but the Orcs were closing in from all sides. The last stronghold of the Imperium, a crumbling fortress, stood tall amidst the burning cityscape. But even it was starting to show signs of breaking under the Orc onslaught. "Men of the Steel Legion," Alrahem's voice rang out across the fortified walls. "We stand here today not as soldiers, but as the last bastion of the Emperor's will. We will not bow to the Orcs. We will stand strong, and we will fight until the last breath leaves our bodies. For Armageddon, for the Emperor." The men of the Steel Legion, despite their exhaustion and weariness, cheered. Their voices filled the air, echoing the spirit of defiance that still burned within them. The time for escape had passed. The time for survival was over. It was now or never. In the distance, the Orc war machines began to stir once more, their engines rumbling as they prepared for the final assault. The sky darkened with the smoke of their weapons, and the ground trembled beneath the weight of their advance. Gazkul Thraka, the monstrous Orc warlord, stood atop his massive warbike, grinning like a wild beast. "Des is the day," Gazkul shouted, raising his fist to the sky. "We's gonna crush 'em." The orcs cheered, their minds set on the final victory. Their war was unstoppable, and nothing could stand in their way. For the war, Guzkul bellowed as he spurred his warbike forward, leading the charge toward the heart of the hive. The orcs charged, their massive war machines trampling everything in their path. Battle wagons roared across the battlefield, their cannons firing relentlessly. Stompers stomped through the ruined city, crushing buildings and soldiers alike with each massive footfall. The orcs were everywhere, and the Imperium's last defenses were beginning to crumble. Back in the underground bunkers, Zayn and Alraham's forces made their final preparations. The tunnels were dark, cold, and claustrophobic, but they provided the only hope the Imperium had left. The last of the Armageddon Steel Legion and Armageddon Guard soldiers moved into position, their weapons ready, their faces grim. "We'll hold them here," Zayn said, his voice filled with resolve. "For as long as we can. This is our last chance. We will make the Emperor proud." Then, the soldiers nodded in agreement, their eyes set with determination. This would be their final battle. The orcs breached the surface defenses in a matter of hours, and the first wave of their assault came crashing down upon the underground bunkers. The ground shook as orc bombs detonated above, sending tremors through the tunnels. "Hold the line," Alraham shouted as the orcs flooded into the tunnels. The sound of orc war cries filled the air, drowning out everything else as the two armies clashed in the dark, narrow spaces beneath the hive. The battle raged for hours, the orcs relentless in their charge, and the Imperium soldiers, though outnumbered and exhausted, fought with all the strength they could muster. The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder and the sound of lasgun fire. Alraham fought fiercely, his sword slashing through orc after orc as he pushed forward, leading his men with unyielding strength. Zayn, too, was in the thick of the fight, his lasgun firing in precise bursts as he helped his soldiers hold the line. Hours passed, and the orcs continued to push forward. Despite the best efforts of the Imperial soldiers, the orc horde was simply too powerful. It was clear that the battle was lost. But still, they fought on. They would not surrender. "For the Emperor," Alraham shouted as he raised his sword high, his voice carrying over the battle. "We will not let Armageddon fall." The sound of battle echoed through the crumbling streets of Armageddon's last stronghold. The Steel Legion, along with the remnants of the Armageddon Guard, were locked in a fight to the death in the heart of the northern hive. The orcs had pushed them to the brink, but the soldiers of the Imperium had not surrendered. They would not. Not while a single man remained to fight. Captain Alraham crouched behind a barricade, his lasgun aimed at the advancing orc forces. His hands were slick with sweat, and his breath came in shallow gasps. His armor was battered, and his body ached from the strain of endless combat. The ground shook beneath him as orc stompers stomped across the battlefield, their massive forms crushing anything in their path. "Hold the line," Alraham shouted to his men, though his voice was barely audible over the roar of gunfire and explosions. His heart pounded in his chest. There were no more reserves, no reinforcements coming. This was it, the last stand. The orcs were relentless. They came in waves, their crude, violent forces crashing against the Imperium's positions. Their war machines rolled forward, guns blazing, while their foot soldiers surged ahead with maddening ferocity. "Incoming!" a voice shouted from the right. Alraham turned to see a battle wagon barreling toward them, its guns firing in all directions. The Steel Legion's heavy weapons opened fire, but the sheer weight of the orc vehicle was too much for their weapons to handle. "Get clear," Alraham barked. "Fall back to the next position." The soldiers scrambled to move, some firing their lasguns at the advancing orc boys, while others grabbed the wounded and dragged them away from the incoming fire. The battle wagon was closing in fast, its massive wheels churning the dirt beneath it. Then, just as it was about to hit their position, a blast of blue light cut through the air. The battle wagon was obliterated in an instant, torn apart by a barrage of missile launchers fired from the distant buildings. "Fire support!" Alraham shouted, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and fury. The orcs were relentless, but they were not invincible. At the Imperial command, General Zayn stood at the center of the room, staring at the holographic map of the battlefield. The Orc forces were still pressing forward, and their momentum was only increasing. He had given the order to fall back, to retreat to the underground bunkers, but even that was beginning to show signs of failure. "Sir, we're losing the eastern sector," Colonel Schaefer said, his voice strained. He handed Zane a datapad, which displayed the latest report. "The Orcs have breached the defenses in multiple areas. We need to make a decision, sir." Zane took the pad and studied it for a moment. His face was drawn with the weight of the decision he had to make. The Imperium's forces were shattered, their morale low. He had no illusions about the odds, but he was determined to fight until the end. "We will hold the line in the northern hive for as long as we can," Zane said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "We will not let Armageddon fall without a fight." Schaefer nodded, though his eyes betrayed the concern he felt. "Understood, sir, but there's only so much we can do. The Orcs are closing in on all sides." "I know, Colonel," Zane said quietly, his gaze turning back to the holographic map. He looked at the surrounding areas, each one more hopeless than the last. The Orcs were everywhere, their forces sprawling across the planet, devouring everything in their path. "We fight for the Emperor," Zane continued, his voice taking on a somber tone. "We fight for every man who died before us, and we will die in the name of the Imperium." Meanwhile, Captain Alrahem led his men into the underground tunnels, the last bastion of defense. The walls of the tunnels were cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of sweat and fear. The remnants of the Steel Legion and Armageddon Guard huddled together, their faces grim as they made their way deeper into the bowels of the hive. "We'll make our stand here," Alrahem said as he stopped in front of a massive reinforced door. "This is the last position we can hold. If they breach this, there's nowhere else to go." The soldiers set to work quickly, securing the entrance, placing explosives along the walls, and setting up the last of their weapons. It was a final, desperate attempt to slow the Orc onslaught. "Set up the heavy bolters," Alrahem ordered. "Prepare for the Orc charge. This is our last chance." As they moved into position, the sound of Orc war machines reverberated through the tunnels, growing louder with each passing second. The air was thick with tension, and every soldier knew that this would be their final stand. Back at the hive's heart, General Zane received a report that sent a chill down his spine. The Orc stompers had reached the northern entrance. They were no longer holding back. "They're here, sir." The voice on the other end of the comms was grim. "The stompers are in the northern sector. We're out of time." Zane swallowed hard. This was the moment of truth. His mind raced with the weight of his decisions. There were no more choices left. This was the end. "Prepare the men for the final charge," Zane ordered, his voice steady but filled with the finality of a man who knew the end was near. "We fight to the last." As the Orc stompers breached the last of the defenses, Captain Alrahem led his men forward, firing their lasguns at the advancing Orcs. The roar of battle filled the air, as the last of the Imperium's soldiers fought desperately to slow the tide of destruction. "For the Emperor," Alrahem shouted, leading his men into the fray. His voice was filled with determination, even as his body screamed for rest. The Orcs were upon them, and the time for retreat had passed. The battle raged for hours, the Orcs overwhelming the Imperium's forces with sheer numbers. The tunnels ran red with blood, and the sound of war echoed through the walls of Armageddon's last stronghold. Despite the relentless assault, the soldiers fought on, their weapons flashing in the dim light, their spirits unbroken. "For the Emperor!" Alrahem shouted again, his voice hoarse. His lasgun ran dry, and he switched to his combat knife, slashing at the Orc boys as they surged forward. Every Orc he struck down was another step toward their inevitable demise. But still, he fought. At last, the tunnels were silent. The Orcs had breached the final line of defense, and the remnants of the Steel Legion and Armageddon Guard were no more. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. The war for Armageddon was drawing to its inevitable conclusion. The battlefield had shifted, and the once proud bastions of the Imperial Guard were nothing but rubble. The Orc forces had torn through every line of defense, overwhelming the last pockets of resistance. But in the midst of all this destruction, there were still a few who refused to give up. General Zane stood at the heart of the command center, staring at the holographic map that flickered with the last remaining signals of Imperial forces. The orcs were everywhere, closing in from all sides. His fingers trembled slightly as he touched the map, and for a moment he allowed himself a brief flicker of doubt. The end was near. The Imperium's last defenders were about to fall. "Sir, the orcs are almost through the last defenses." Colonel Schaefer's voice was filled with resignation. "We've held them off for days, but now we're out of options." Zane swallowed hard, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The last of his forces, a battered and broken group of soldiers, were retreating to the final stronghold. The tunnels beneath the hive were the last refuge. If they couldn't hold here, there would be no one left to fight. "We make one last stand." Zane's voice rang out with quiet authority. "We fight for the Emperor, for Armageddon. We don't retreat, and we don't surrender. Not today." He turned to face his officers, all of them weary, their faces etched with the pain of a war that had lasted far too long. But despite the exhaustion, there was no hesitation in their eyes. The time for retreat was gone. This was it. "Prepare the men for the final charge," Zane continued, his words now coming faster, more intense. "We will fight until there is no fight left. If we die with honor. The Emperor will remember us." Colonel Schaefer nodded and immediately began issuing orders. There was no time to waste. The orcs were already at the gates. In the depths of the hive, Captain Alrahem was preparing his men for their final assault. The last stronghold was just ahead, and the walls around them were trembling from the constant bombardment of orc artillery. There was no question now. This was the end. "Listen up," Alrahem shouted as he stood in front of his weary men. His voice cut through the quiet murmur of the soldiers, their faces marked with exhaustion and fear. But there was no mistaking the fire in their eyes. They had fought and bled for this moment. They would die for it too. "This is our last chance. We have one final push left. The orcs are coming. We'll hold this position for as long as we can. If we fall together. If we die as men of the Imperium." The men raised their weapons and gave a collective cheer, the sound of their voices loud enough to drown out the distant thrum of orc engines. It was a rallying cry, a final burst of defiance in the face of certain doom. "For the Emperor," Alrahem shouted, his voice filled with determination. "For Armageddon." The soldiers echoed the chant, their voices rising in unison, a final cry of defiance that would ring out across the battlefield. As Alrahem and his men made their way to the final position, the ground shook with the heavy steps of orc stompers. The massive war machines were closing in, their guns firing relentlessly, tearing apart everything in their path. The orcs were unrelenting, their numbers seemingly endless. But the Steel Legion and the Armageddon Guard would fight to the bitter end. "We hold this position," Alrahem commanded as he set up his men along the barricades. "We fight for the Emperor, and we die for Armageddon." The soldiers took their positions, their lasguns aimed at the approaching orc forces. The sound of gunfire echoed through the tunnels as the first wave of orcs crashed into their position. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and the sound of explosions. The orcs were everywhere, swarming the defenders with wave after wave of their crude but deadly forces. "Keep firing," Alrahem shouted, his voice hoarse but filled with resolve. "Don't let them through!" The men fired in unison, their weapons flashing in the dim light as they fought to hold the line. For every orc that fell, another took its place, but the soldiers of the Imperium fought on, their resolve unbroken. Back at the Imperial command, Zane watched the battle unfold from his command center. His men were holding, but it was clear that the end was near. The orc forces were closing in on all sides, their overwhelming numbers threatening to crush the last of the Imperium's defenders. "We're out of time, sir," Colonel Schaefer said, his voice heavy with defeat. "The last of our forces are retreating into the hive. We've lost the northern sector, and the orcs are moving in fast." Zane's face hardened, but his resolve remained. The Imperium would not die without a fight. He had given everything to this war, and he would die with honor. "Prepare for the final charge," Zane said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. For the Emperor, for Armageddon, we fight to the last." As the battle reached its peak, the final charge began. Alrahem and his men made their way through the hive, firing their weapons as they encountered wave after wave of Orc forces. The fight was brutal, and the air was thick with the smell of blood and death. Every soldier fought with everything they had left, their lasguns flashing in the darkness as they fired into the oncoming Orcs. The sound of battle filled the air, and Alrahem could hear the cries of his men as they fought for survival. Some fell in the darkness, their screams echoing through the hive, but the rest pressed on, determined to make their final stand. At last, the Orcs breached the final position. The walls were torn apart, and the last of the Imperium's defenders were overwhelmed. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. The walls of the hive were shaking. The last of the Imperium's defenses were crumbling beneath the relentless onslaught of the Orc forces, whose sheer numbers and brutal force were enough to overwhelm even the best of the Imperial Guard. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning metal, the loud roar of Orc stompers shaking the ground beneath them. The remaining soldiers of General Zane's command were entrenched in the final stronghold, their weapons blazing as they fought to buy as much time as possible for the last remnants of the Imperium's forces. There was no retreat now. The Steel Legion, once known for their unwavering courage and resilience, were now scattered, their lines broken, their morale in tatters, but they were not broken entirely. Not yet. Zane stood at the heart of the command center, staring into the chaos that was unfolding before him. He could hear the distant sounds of explosions, the screams of his men, the deafening crackle of gunfire. But in the midst of it all, there was a stillness in him, a grim resolve. This was their final stand. "We fight until there's nothing left to fight for," Zane said, his voice firm, his eyes steely with determination. The last of his officers had gathered around him, their faces weary and bloodied, but their eyes still held the spark of defiance. They were ready to die. They would not surrender. "Send the order. We charge," Zane barked. His men were already preparing, gearing up for the last charge, the final attempt to hold off the Orc tide. Captain Alrahem stood in the tunnel entrance, looking out over the battlefield. The Orcs were closing in fast, and their war machines were advancing with unstoppable force, but the Steel Legion was ready. They would not die without a fight. "This is it, men," Alrahem said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We will hold the line until the last man. We fight for the Emperor, for Armageddon. This is our duty, and we will fulfill it, whatever the cost." Aye. The soldiers of the Steel Legion rallied around him, their eyes filled with grim resolve. They had come to Armageddon as defenders, and they would leave as martyrs, if necessary. "For the Emperor," Alrahem shouted, his voice carrying over the battlefield. "For Armageddon." And with that, the final charge began. The ground shook as the Orc stompers marched forward, their massive feet crushing everything in their path. The Orcs were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. The Imperium's forces were dwindling, their guns firing in a futile attempt to halt the Orc advance. But for each Orc that fell, 10 more took its place. "Keep firing," Alrahem shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We will not let them through." The soldiers of the Steel Legion fired in unison, their lasguns flashing as they took down Orc after Orc. But the Orc boys were relentless, charging forward with savage fury. The battle was brutal, and the air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of blood. "For the Emperor!" Alrahem roared, as his men fought with every last ounce of strength. The Orcs were closing in, but the Steel Legion would not yield. They would fight to the last. Meanwhile, General Zane was coordinating the last of his men, directing them to the final defensive positions. The Orcs were close, their forces nearly upon them, but Zane was not going to give up. He would fight with everything he had left, and he would die on his feet, not on his knees. "We are the last line of defense. We will make them regret the day they set foot on this world," Zane shouted, as he rallied his men one final time. His voice was hoarse from the days of shouting orders, but it carried the weight of someone who had given everything. The last of his forces had been fortified in the southern section of the hive, and though the Orc forces were fierce, Zane knew that he and his men had one last fight in them. "Hold the line," Zane shouted, as his men prepared for the final assault. The final charge came faster than Zane had anticipated. The Orc forces came crashing through the last line of defense like an unstoppable wave, their massive war machines roaring in the distance, their war cries shaking the very walls of the hive. "For the Emperor," Zane shouted as he ran headlong into the fray. His men followed suit, charging into the heart of the Orc horde with everything they had left. The battle was brutal, and there was no hope left for retreat. Zane knew that this would be their last stand. There would be no victory, only sacrifice. But even in the face of certain death, he stood tall, determined to fight for the Emperor to the very end. "Hold the line," Zane shouted again, his voice ringing out above the din of battle. "For Armageddon!" The battle lasted hours. Orcs fell, one by one, but the Imperium's soldiers were being overwhelmed. The final charge had failed, and the Orcs had breached the last stronghold. The hive was lost, but in the chaos of battle, as the last defenders of the Imperium were consumed by the Orc horde, something unexpected happened. A small group of Imperial guardsmen, led by Captain Alrome, fought their way through the Orc forces and into the hive's lower tunnels. They would escape. They would live to fight another day. The journey to the lower tunnels was fraught with peril. The Orc forces had overrun the hive's surface, but the underbelly, the labyrinthine tunnels beneath Armageddon, was still holding some hope for the survivors. Captain Alrahem and his men, weary and battle-worn, made their way through the narrow, darkened corridors, the sound of their boots echoing in the silence. "We're almost there," Alrahem said, his voice low and tense. His hands were shaking from exhaustion, but his resolve was as steady as ever. "Stay focused. We're not done yet." The small group of Steel Legion soldiers behind him nodded in silent agreement. They had been through countless battles, faced the Orc hordes at the front lines, and watched the last of the Imperial Guard fall. But they weren't giving up. Not yet. The air was thick with the stench of death and burning flesh. The city above them had become a war zone, the walls of the hive crumbling under the weight of the Orc assault. The last line of defense had fallen, and now the surviving soldiers of Armageddon were fighting to escape the inevitable. "Keep moving," Alrahem ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We'll make it to the lower levels. The shuttle should be there waiting for us." But even as he spoke, Alrahem knew that their escape was not guaranteed. The Orcs were relentless, and they had already sent scouting parties into the hive's lower levels. Their escape could be short-lived. Meanwhile, General Zane had taken command of the final defense. The Orcs had breached the southern section of the hive, and their war machines were charging through the gates. There was no longer any question of survival. His men were dying, and they were surrounded. But there was still hope. A small group had made it through to the tunnels, and if they could survive long enough, they might just reach the extraction point. "Hold them back," Zane shouted, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "For the Emperor, for Armageddon." His voice echoed across the battlefield, but the Imperial forces were struggling. The Orcs were everywhere, and the last remnants of the Steel Legion were being overrun. Zane's men fought with a fury that was born from desperation, but the Orcs were just too many. Every passing moment seemed to bring them closer to their goal, and the lines were quickly breaking. "Don't let them through," Zane ordered as he fired his lasgun into the advancing Orcs. But even as he gave the order, he knew it was only a matter of time before the final defense collapsed. Captain Alrahem's group reached the final checkpoint, the hidden entrance to the lower tunnels that led toward the surface. The narrow hallway was dark, the only light coming from the flickering glow of their helmets. "Almost there," Alrahem muttered under his breath. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his thoughts racing. The Orc forces were close, and time was running out. "Keep moving," Alrahem barked. "We can't afford to stop now." End of 4. The soldiers behind him pushed forward, their steps quickening as they reached the exit. It was a small, unassuming door at the far end of the hallway, but beyond it, there was hope. A shuttle, waiting to carry them to safety, if they could reach it in time. The door was locked, but Alrahem knew the code. He punched in the sequence on the panel beside the door, and with a soft hiss, the door slid open. "We made it!" one of the soldiers shouted, his face breaking into a grin, but the joy was short-lived. As the soldiers moved into the next chamber, a loud crash echoed from the hallway behind them. The Orc war machines were close. The shuttle's engines were already warming up, but the escape was no longer certain. "Hurry!" Alrahem shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "Get to the shuttle." Back at the Imperial Command Center, General Zane had seen the reports. The last of the Steel Legion had made it to the lower levels, and the shuttle was ready to go. But the Orc forces were closing in, and the time for any more decisions was running out. "We've done all we can," Zane muttered to himself, his voice hollow. He had given everything, and now, as the walls closed in, the fate of the Imperium's last defenders rested on the shoulders of a few survivors. "For the Emperor," Zane whispered, his voice quiet as he realized the truth. The battle was lost, but the truth, the memory of Armageddon, would survive. That was all that mattered. Captain Alrahem's group reached the shuttle just in time. The Orc forces were now at the base of the hive, their war machines closing in, but the shuttle had enough power to make a run for it. They had a chance. It was their only chance. The shuttle's ramp closed, and the engines roared to life, lifting off from the surface of Armageddon. The sight of the burning world below them faded into the distance as the shuttle soared into the sky. "We made it," one of the soldiers whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. But Alrahem knew the truth. This was only the beginning. The Orcs had not been fully defeated. The Imperium would not abandon Armageddon, but the survivors would have to carry the legacy of their fallen comrades, and perhaps, in time, they would return. The shuttle climbed higher, breaking through the atmosphere and into the dark reaches of space. Armageddon receded behind them, a distant memory, a burning world. "For the Emperor," Alrahem said softly, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "For Armageddon." The hum of the shuttle's engines filled the air, a constant reminder of the narrow escape. The small group of survivors sat in silence, their faces haunted by the horrors of the last few days. They had fought for survival, and now, as the burning world of Armageddon receded into the distance, they were left with nothing but the memory of the fight and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Captain Alrahem sat at the front of the shuttle, his hands gripping the armrest tightly. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The loss of his comrades weighed heavily on him, but it was the future that troubled him most. What would happen now? Where would they go? And, most importantly, could they ever recover from the devastation they had witnessed? "How long until we reach the Imperial fleet?" Alrahem asked, his voice breaking the silence. The shuttle pilot, a Steel Legionnaire with a face as hard as the rocks of the hive, glanced over his shoulder. "We're about 2 hours away from rendezvous, sir." Alrahem nodded. 2 hours. It felt like a lifetime. The shuttle was small, and the silence was unbearable. The soldiers around him were tired, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. They had seen too much, lost too much. They needed rest, but there was no time for that. There was no time to mourn. They had survived, and that was the only thing that mattered now. As the shuttle continued its journey, Captain Alrahem couldn't help but think of the battle that had brought them to this point. The Orc invasion had been brutal, overwhelming in its ferocity. The last stand at the hive had been a desperate fight, and they had lost so much. His men had given everything, and now they were survivors, nothing more than remnants of a once great force. But there was still hope. As long as they had breath, there was a chance to rebuild. The Imperium was vast, and though Armageddon had fallen, the war was not over. They would regroup, rebuild, and someday they would strike back. For the Emperor, for the Imperium. "Captain," a voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see one of the soldiers, Lieutenant Athelius, standing beside him. The young officer's face was grim, his eyes full of sorrow. "What now?" Alrahem sighed deeply. The question had been on his mind since the shuttle had left the surface of Armageddon. What now? What did they do with the scraps of their once proud army? What could they rebuild when everything seemed lost? "We survive," Alrahem said quietly. "We rebuild. We may have lost Armageddon, but we haven't lost the war. The Imperium is still out there, and as long as we have breath, we fight for it." Athelius nodded slowly, but the doubt in his eyes remained. The truth was, None of them knew what would happen next. They had escaped the madness of Armageddon, but now they were alone. The world they had fought to protect was gone, and the future was uncertain. The journey to the Imperial fleet was long, but the survivors passed the time as best they could. Some slept, others cleaned their weapons, and a few simply stared out the windows of the shuttle, lost in their own thoughts. The hum of the engines was a constant background noise, a reminder of the dangerous, unknown future ahead. 2 hours passed, and the fleet finally came into view, a massive group of warships floating silently in the cold void of space. The sight of the fleet brought a sense of relief, but also a new wave of uncertainty. They had made it this far, but what would they face now? Would the Imperium accept them back, or would they be cast aside as failures? As the shuttle approached the fleet, the tension on board was palpable. No one spoke as the shuttle docked, the familiar hiss of the airlock echoing through the quiet shuttle. The ramp lowered, and the survivors stepped out, greeted by a handful of Imperial Navy personnel. "Captain Al-Rahem," a voice called, and Al-Rahem turned to see a man in the uniform of an inquisitorial acolyte approaching. "Yes, I'm Al-Rahem," he replied, standing tall despite the exhaustion that weighed him down. "We've come from Armageddon. We need to report to the fleet commander." The Inquisitor nodded, his expression unreadable. "You'll have your debriefing shortly. But first, there's someone who wishes to speak with you." And the survivors followed the Inquisitor through the sterile, metallic hallways of the ship. The Imperial Navy vessel was a massive, cold machine, filled with the clamor of a warship preparing for battle. But there was an eerie sense of stillness in the air, as if the ship itself was waiting for something. They reached a small briefing room, where a high-ranking officer in power armor was waiting for them. His insignia marked him as a commissar, but there was something different about him. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and he radiated authority. "Captain Al-Rahem," the commissar said, his voice low but filled with power, "I've been briefed on your actions. You and your men fought valiantly, and for that, you have my respect. But now, we need to talk about the future. The Imperium has lost much, but we are not without hope. Your next steps will decide the fate of Armageddon's survivors. Do you understand?" Al-Rahem stood at attention, his shoulders straight, his resolve unwavering. "I understand, Commissar. We will rebuild. We will fight for the Emperor." The Commissar nodded slowly. "Very well. Prepare for your debriefing. After that, we will discuss your next mission. The war is far from over." The next few hours were filled with briefings, reports, and debriefings. The survivors of Armageddon were given quarters, and each soldier was given a new mission. There was no time for rest. The war had not ended, and there was much to be done. The loss of Armageddon was devastating, but the Imperium could not afford to dwell on it. They would regroup, rebuild, and press forward. As Al-Rahem stood in the briefing room, looking out the window at the vastness of space, he felt the weight of the universe pressing down on him. Armageddon had fallen, but he had not. The fight was not over. Not yet. The Orc threat still loomed, but the Imperium was not broken. Not yet. The war would continue, and the Steel Legion would fight for the Emperor, for Armageddon, and for the future of the Imperium. "For the Emperor," Al-Rahem whispered, his voice filled with quiet resolve. The next few weeks aboard the Imperial Navy ship were filled with tense silence and anticipation. The survivors of Armageddon were no longer fighting for survival, but for something even more daunting: rebuilding. They had escaped the chaos, but what would they return to? The Orcs were still a looming threat, and the Imperium was still reeling from the catastrophic losses. Captain Al-Rahem stood on the observation deck, gazing out into the abyss of space. The stars twinkled in the distance, but they offered little comfort. His thoughts were elsewhere, back on Armageddon, on the men and women who had fought and died to defend it, and on the legacy they would leave behind. "Captain," came the voice of Lieutenant Athelius, his tone respectful but tinged with the exhaustion of the long journey. "We've received new orders." Al-Rahem turned, his brow furrowed. "What orders?" Athelius handed him a datapad, the screen flickering briefly before the message appeared. "Reinforce remaining Imperial defenses in the Segmentum Obscurus. Join the war effort to retake lost planets. Immediate departure in 48 hours." Al-Rahim scanned the message, his expression hardening. He knew what this meant. The Imperium was not finished with Armageddon, but it had to fight on many fronts. There would be no respite, no time for healing. "We fight for the Emperor, always," Al-Rahim said, his voice steady. Athelius nodded. "We've lost much, Captain, but we still have a purpose. We still have hope." Al-Rahim clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the past few weeks pressing on his shoulders. He had seen his comrades die. He had seen Armageddon fall. But even now, as the world of his past burned away, he could still feel the fire of duty burning inside him. "We rebuild. We press forward. For the Emperor." The shuttle was ready. The Steel Legion had been assigned to a new mission, and it was time to leave the safety of the Imperial Navy's fleet and re-enter the battlefield. Their journey would take them to the far reaches of the Segmentum Obscurus, where the remnants of the Orc forces were still wreaking havoc across several planets. The shuttle's engines roared to life, and the craft was soon soaring through the stars. Captain Al-Rahim sat in the cockpit, staring out into the vast expanse of space. His mind raced, filled with thoughts of what awaited them. The last few months had been a blur of pain and loss, but now they were on the verge of something new. They were no longer running from the Orcs, they were hunting them. They were the hunters now, the ones who would stand tall in the face of the Orc menace and reclaim the lost worlds. "We're almost there, Captain," the pilot said, his voice calm but serious. "Target planet is within range." "Good. Prepare for landing," Al-Rahim replied, his voice sharp and filled with purpose. The planet Vigilus had once been a strategic stronghold in the Segmentum Obscurus, but now it was a shattered world, its defenses breached and its surface scorched by constant war. The Orc forces had claimed it, and their control over the planet was unyielding. The Steel Legion had been tasked with retaking Vigilus. It was a suicide mission for most, but for Captain Al-Rahim and his men, it was a duty they would carry out until their last breath. As the shuttle touched down on the planet's surface, the soldiers prepared for what would undoubtedly be one of the most brutal battles of their lives. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the sound of Orc war machines rumbling in the distance. The sky was dark with smoke, and the stench of blood and death hung in the air. But Al-Rahim was resolute. He had seen too much to back down now. His men had seen too much. "For the Emperor," Al-Rahim shouted, his voice ringing out across the battlefield as the doors of the shuttle opened. The soldiers rushed out, their lasguns at the ready, their faces set in grim determination. The Orc war machines were coming, and they would not relent. But the Steel Legion was ready. They had fought at Armageddon, and they would fight here, for their Emperor, for their comrades, for the Imperium. The battle raged for hours, the ground shaking as Orc stompers crashed through the defenses, their massive guns firing relentlessly. The Imperial Guard soldiers fought with everything they had, their lasguns flashing as they held their ground. But the Orcs were relentless. They charged forward, their war cries shaking the very air. The Steel Legion fought back with brutal efficiency, but even they could not hold back the overwhelming tide of green-skinned beasts. "We hold the line," Al-Rahim shouted as he fired his lasgun into the advancing Orcs. His men followed his lead, pushing forward with everything they had. The line held, but just barely. The Orcs were close, too close. "For the Emperor," one of his men cried, his voice filled with determination as he threw himself into the fray. "We will die fighting." And die they did. The battle was a bloodbath. The Steel Legion held their ground, but at a terrible cost. Soldiers fell by the dozen, their bodies littering the battlefield, their sacrifice echoing in the hearts of the survivors. But despite the overwhelming odds, they did not give up. They fought with everything they had left. They fought because they knew there was no other choice. The Imperium would survive, even if they didn't, as the final Orc war machines were taken down, and the last of the Orc forces were routed. Captain Al-Rahim stood amidst the wreckage, his face grim. The battle was over, but the cost had been high. He looked down at the fallen soldiers of the Steel Legion, their bodies scattered across the battlefield. Their sacrifice had not been in vain. The Imperium would rebuild. The Emperor's will had been done. For the Emperor, Al-Rahim whispered, his voice quiet but resolute. For Armageddon, the battle for Vigilus was over. The Orc forces had been driven from the planet, their war machines reduced to rubble, and their forces scattered. The Imperium had won, but at a heavy cost. The survivors of Captain Al-Rahim's unit stood on the scorched earth, their faces weary, their bodies battered, but their spirits unbroken. Al-Rahim surveyed the battlefield. The wreckage of Orc war machines scattered across the landscape. The skies were still dark with the smoke of battle, but there was a feeling of quiet victory in the air. For the first time in months, the soldiers of the Steel Legion could breathe. The immediate threat had been quelled, but what lay ahead was uncertain. The war was far from over. "The planet is secure for now," said Lieutenant Athelius, who had come up beside Al-Rahim. "But we're not out of the woods yet, sir. The Orcs are a persistent enemy. We've only pushed them back for the moment." Then, Al-Rahim nodded solemnly. "I know, Athelius. The war is never over. But we've won this round, and we've shown that we will not back down. The Imperium lives, and it will endure." The soldiers of the Steel Legion were regrouping, preparing for the next phase of the fight. Vigilus had been retaken, but the Orc threat was still present across the Segmentum Obscurus. The Imperium was spread thin. Its forces stretched across countless worlds. The victory on Vigilus was just one part of the larger war. As the hours passed, Al-Rahim found himself alone, standing on the outskirts of the battlefield, staring out into the distance. The feeling of victory was fleeting, and the weight of the past few months pressed down on him. Armageddon had been lost, and though they had survived, they had lost much. Their comrades, their homes, their world, all gone in an instant. For the Emperor, Al-Rahim whispered to himself, trying to find some semblance of peace. It was a phrase he had repeated countless times throughout the war, but now it felt hollow. The Emperor had not been there to protect them. He had been absent in their darkest hour, and yet they still fought, for duty, for honor, for the Imperium. We fight because we must. We fight because it is the will of the Emperor. He clenched his fists, steeling himself for the days to come. The war was far from over, and there were more battles to be fought, more planets to defend. Days passed, and the survivors of Vigilus were given a brief reprieve. They were assigned to rest and recovery, but the weight of the war hung heavy on them. They had been in constant battle for so long that the idea of peace, of rest, felt foreign. But as they gathered their strength, they began to realize something: the fight was changing. It was no longer just about survival, it was about something more. It was about redemption. "What do we do now?" Lieutenant Athelius asked, his voice quiet but filled with uncertainty. "The war's not over, but we're not sure where we go from here." Al-Rahim turned to face him, his gaze distant. "We rebuild." His voice was calm, steady. "We rebuild, and we move forward. We find a way to strike back, to take the fight to them. We don't have the luxury of waiting. The Orcs won't stop until we do, and we will never stop. We will rebuild, and we will strike back. For the Imperium, for Armageddon." Athelius nodded, his expression grim. For the Emperor. Al-Rahim and his men spent the next several days regrouping, gathering intelligence on the Orc presence in the region. They had pushed the Orcs back from Vigilus, but there were still many worlds under siege. The Imperium had to act quickly. There was no time to rest, no time to heal. They had to strike while the Orcs were still disoriented from the battle, and they had to do it soon. "We're not just fighting for survival anymore," Al-Rahim said to his men as they gathered in the briefing room. "We're fighting for the future. We're fighting for the Imperium, and we're fighting for all those who can't fight for themselves. The Orcs have taken too much from us, but we are not defeated. We will rise again. We will strike back." The men of the Steel Legion nodded in agreement, their resolve firm. They had lost so much, but they still had their duty, their purpose. They were soldiers of the Imperium, and they would continue to fight, no matter the cost. "We rebuild," Al-Rahim repeated, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We rebuild, and we strike back. For the Emperor, for Vigilus, for the future." As the battle for Vigilus raged on, The survivors of the Steel Legion began to realize the full extent of what they had lost. The war was far from over, and there were still many battles to be fought. But they were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for redemption, for the future of the Imperium, and for the memory of all those who had fallen in the fight. "For the Emperor!" Al-Rahem shouted, leading his men into the fray. "For the Imperium!" The Steel Legion charged forward, their lasguns blazing, their resolve unshaken. They fought for the Emperor, for their comrades, and for the future of the Imperium. The countdown to the final assault had begun. Captain Al-Rahem stood at the front of his troops, watching as the last few hours of preparation passed by. The battlefield on Vigilus was as grim as they came: broken cities, crumbling spires, and an enemy that refused to give up. The Orc forces were regrouping for one final push, and the Imperium had to hold its ground at all costs. Al-Rahem had spent the last few days preparing his men, rallying them with speeches of hope and duty, but deep inside, he knew the truth. The Orcs had grown stronger. Their numbers were vast, and the Imperium's forces were stretched thin. They would have to hold this line, or everything would be lost. The mission was simple: secure the southern sector of the planet and establish a defensive perimeter. The Orcs were attempting to break through, and the Steel Legion would stand firm. "We've come this far," Al-Rahem said, his voice steady. "We fight for the Emperor. We fight for the future of the Imperium. This is the last stand, and we will not falter. No retreat, no surrender. For the Emperor. For the Emperor," the soldiers echoed, their voices a unified roar that echoed through the halls of the command center. As the hours ticked by, the Steel Legion prepared for the inevitable. The Orc forces were gathering on the horizon, their monstrous war machines rolling forward, their wah cries filling the air. The ground trembled beneath the approaching forces, and the distant rumble of war engines grew louder. The Steel Legion had no illusions about the fight ahead. The Orcs were savage, relentless, and far too numerous. But they had one advantage: they had the will to survive. The Imperium had trained them to fight against impossible odds, to stand firm even when it seemed like all hope was lost. "We stand here, not as men, but as the Emperor's will made flesh," Al-Rahem reminded his troops, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "We are the last line of defense. We will not fall, not today." As they took their positions, Al-Rahem's mind wandered back to the battle for Armageddon. It had been another fight for survival, another battle that had seemed unwinnable, but they had survived, and they had emerged victorious. This time, it would be no different. Vigilus would be theirs. The first wave of Orc forces hit hard. The Wah was upon them, and the sheer force of the assault was overwhelming. The Steel Legion stood their ground, firing lasgun after lasgun into the oncoming horde. Explosions filled the air. The ground shook with the impact of Orc bombs, and the screams of the dying echoed across the battlefield. "Hold the line," Al-Rahem shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Don't give an inch. For the Emperor, in." The soldiers obeyed, their faces grim, their bodies moving on autopilot as they fought with everything they had. They were tired, their bodies bruised and battered, but they would not stop. They couldn't stop. Not now. But the Orc forces were relentless. The Wah seemed to go on forever, the Orcs pressing forward like a tidal wave, their war machines firing as they advanced. And yet, the Steel Legion did not falter. They stood firm, their lasguns flashing, their artillery firing in perfect synchronization. The sky above was black with smoke, and the air was thick with the scent of blood and fire. Captain Al-Rahem felt a sense of desperation growing in his chest. The line was holding, but just barely. The Orcs were relentless, and every second that passed brought them closer to the breaking point. In the command center, Lieutenant Athelius watched the battle unfold through the surveillance feeds. The sight of the Steel Legion fighting with such tenacity filled him with pride. They were a formidable force, but even they could not hold forever against the Orc onslaught. "The line's holding, but not for long," Athelius muttered to himself, his fingers dancing over the console. He activated the comlink to Captain Al-Rahem. "Captain," Athelius said, his voice filled with urgency, "we need to fall back. The orcs are overwhelming us. We need reinforcements now, or we won't last. Al-Rahem's voice crackled through the comlink, steady despite the chaos around him. We hold the line, Lieutenant. We don't retreat. Not now, not ever. For the Emperor. Athelius clenched his fists, his heart pounding. The decision had already been made. There would be no retreat. There would be no surrender. The Steel Legion would stand, and they would fight until the end. The battle raged on for hours. The Steel Legion fought with all their might, their bravery and determination unyielding. But as the hours passed, the situation grew more dire. The Orc forces were relentless, and the Imperium's forces were being pushed to their breaking point. We're running out of time, Al-Rahem thought, his mind racing. We can't hold forever. We need reinforcements, or we'll be overrun. But even as he thought these words, he knew the truth. Reinforcements were not coming. There was no one left to help them. It was just them, the Steel Legion and the Orcs, and they would fight until the end. Finally, as the battle reached its climax, a new sound filled the air. The roar of Imperial reinforcements. Al-Rahem turned to see the Imperial Guard arriving, their tanks rolling onto the battlefield, their guns blazing. The Orc forces had been pushed back, and the Steel Legion had held their ground. The battle was won, but it had come at a terrible cost. The Steel Legion had suffered immense casualties, their numbers dwindling with every passing moment. But they had survived, and in the end, that was all that mattered. The battlefield had fallen silent, the echoes of war fading into the distant horizon. The Steel Legion had held their ground, but the cost had been great. The planet Vigilus had been reclaimed, the Orc threat repelled, but the survivors knew it came at a price. As the dust settled and the survivors began to gather, the realization hit them. The war was not over, not by a long shot. Captain Al-Rahim stood alone on the outskirts of the battlefield, gazing at the wreckage around him. The remains of Orc war machines littered the land, their twisted forms a grim testament to the chaos they had brought. The air was thick with the scent of death and burning wreckage, but there was also a strange stillness. The Wa had been silenced, but there were many more battles to come. We won, but at what cost? Al-Rahem muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. Beside him, Lieutenant Athelius approached, his expression grim. Captain, we've secured the sector. The Orcs are retreating, but our casualties are severe. We've lost nearly half our men. Al-Rahem nodded, his face hard. I know, Athelius. It's the price we pay for victory, but we've done our duty. We've secured Vigilus, and that's what matters. We have to hold on to that. Athelius looked out over the battlefield, his eyes scanning the bodies of the fallen. What about the rest of the war, sir? The Orcs will return. The Imperium is still spread thin. We can't keep fighting like this forever. Al-Rahem's gaze hardened. We keep fighting until we can't anymore. For the Emperor, we survive and we rebuild. That's the only way forward. In the days that followed, the Steel Legion worked tirelessly to rebuild. The survivors, exhausted and battered, picked through the wreckage of the battle, recovering what they could and setting up a makeshift base of operations. They knew their respite would be brief. The Orc forces would return eventually, and the Imperium would need to be ready. But it wasn't just the physical rebuilding that weighed on Al-Rahem. It was the psychological toll of the war, the loss of so many comrades, and the uncertainty of the future. For the first time, he found himself questioning the purpose of it all. The Emperor's will was clear, but the sacrifices, the endless battles, were they truly worth it? Captain? A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts, and Al-Rahem turned to see Lieutenant Athelius standing behind him. The rest of the survivors have gathered. They're waiting for you. End quote. Al-Rahem sighed and stood, wiping the dust from his uniform. Let's go. The survivors of the battle gathered in the makeshift briefing room, their faces somber but resolute. The room was filled with the smell of stale air, and the quiet murmur of conversations died down as Al-Rahem entered. He took his place at the front, looking at the faces of the men and women who had fought and survived by his side. The weight of the moment was heavy, but he knew there was no time to mourn. They had a duty to complete. We've done it, Al-Rahem began, his voice steady. We've taken back Vigilus, but we've lost so much along the way. I know we're all tired. I know we've all lost people we care about. But we can't stop now. The war is far from over. The orcs are still out there, and we have to be ready for whatever comes next. There was a long silence before Athelius spoke. What happens next, sir? What do we do? Al-Rahem looked out over the room, his gaze settling on each face. We rebuild, we regroup, we prepare for the next fight, but we do it together, as one. We've lost a lot, but we've gained something as well. We've gained the strength to carry on. The Imperium will survive, and we will make sure of it. The days turned into weeks as the survivors of Steel Legion continued their work. They repaired equipment, tended to the wounded, and prepared for the next phase of the war. But even as they worked, a quiet sense of uncertainty hung over them. What would the future hold? How many more battles could they endure before they were overwhelmed? Al-Rahem often found himself alone, standing at the edge of the battlefield, looking out over the ruins of the once thriving city of Vigilus. The scars of war were everywhere, but there was something else, a glimmer of hope. They had won. Against all odds, they had won. For the Emperor, Al-Rahem whispered, the words carrying the weight of a lifetime of war. It was the mantra that had guided him through the darkest of times, and it would continue to guide him now. The Imperium would endure. It had to, for the sake of those who had died, for the sake of those who still fought, and for the sake of the future.